Egyptian licorice, what, you want to make a federal case out of it? Hello dudes, dudettes, duders, and everyone in between, and welcome to How to Do Everything So You Don't Have to, the show where we teach you how to think like a producer. Friends of the channel have heard us crow about the joys of half-frame photography, and let's be honest, there's a lot to crow about, but as I enter my autumn years, I realize that half-frame photography is for greasy little feckless cowards with no sense of vision or ambition. After personal introspection, it's become clear that half-frame photography lands somewhere between a cockroach and that white stuff that accumulates at the corner of your mouth when you're really thirsty. If you're a man-type man with man pants and muscles thick as Irish cuts of bacon, you know the truth. Half-frame photography is out. Quarter-frame photography is where it's at. This is the ViewMaster personal stereo camera, easily the weirdest camera in our kit. And we are no strangers to weird cameras. In this video, we'll cover its brilliant and bizarre design, the best practices for actually shooting and viewing stereo photographs, and our opinions regarding whether or not this one is worth the cost of entry. Spoiler alert, when you print your first stereograph card and see your children brought to life in 3 crisp dimensions instead of 2, you will immediately realize that there's nothing else quite like it in the world. Just ask Brian May. So yeah, it's worth it, but only if you don't mind tinkering a little bit, both while shooting and when you finish the photos. Of course, we'll be sharing heaps of stereo images captured on this camera, which we'll be presenting in 2 formats, side-by-side and anaglyph. If you have red-blue glasses, those should work just fine for viewing the images. If you don't, you can pause the video and draw your finger from your screen towards your eyes until you're a little bit cross-eyed and the 2 images converge into one. It takes some practice, but is the most efficient way to view 3D images without any special apparata. Let's get into it, starting with the design. The ViewMaster personal stereo camera is an object of rare beauty. On one hand, it's among the simplest cameras I've ever used. On the other, it's among the most complicated. Let's look at what makes it simple first. On top, you have 2 dials, one for shutter speed and the other for aperture. As you rotate either dial, a readout disc translates the changes into plain language. Do you want your subject color to be light on a cloudy day when shooting ISO 100? Well, set your shutter to 1/100th of a second and open your aperture to f5.6. Do you want your subject average on a sunny day on the same stock? Well, take it to f16. There are limitations to this system which reveal the age of the camera. First, ASA caps at 100 with options for 5, 10, 15, 25, 50, and 100 ISO film stocks. Good luck finding a roll of 5 ASA film at your local CVS. If you're shooting on anything above 100, you'll have to do the calculations in your head or with a light meter. But hey, if you're shooting on a stereo camera that's been sitting around for half a century, things like checking exposure shouldn't scare you away. The journey is the destination. Also, this camera was built for outdoor daylight photography. Since you're shooting quarter frame, you want the finest grain you can find to help compensate for the loss in resolution. We feed this beast a steady diet of Ektar 100 with T-Max 100 as an occasional snack. If you're new to the camera, you might consider putting a couple of rolls of Kodak Gold through it first, as that's a neutral and fairly forgiving stock that will let you know how accurate the shutter is. When a camera turns 50, it's simply not as snappy, pun intended, as the day it rolled off the assembly line, or anvil, or mule-drawn mill, or however they made these things. You just go in assuming the shutter moves a little slower than it did back in the day, and you do some tests to see if shots are coming out overexposed. Shutter speed variance and film stock preferences aside, this system is the most intuitive design I've ever seen for explaining the triangle of exposure in human terms with an organic interface that gives feedback on how adjustments relate to each other. When I said that this is the simplest camera I've ever used, I wasn't lying. But it's also the most complicated. All right, you math heads, let's kick this thing into high gear. This is a quarter frame camera. So when you load a roll of 36 exposures, you're actually taking 144 shots. That said, it's stereo photography, so each shot comes in pairs, meaning that you're only pressing the shutter button about 72 times per roll. A normal half-frame camera splits the frame vertically, giving you images that are taller than they are wide. This camera splits the frame horizontally, shooting on the top half of the roll first, and then shooting on the bottom half. If that's not far enough afield, it actually splits an exposure across 3 frames, with one eye landing on frame 1, frame 2 acting as a buffer, and the second eye landing on frame 3. This is the only camera I've shot on that has a reverse setting. You shoot the top half of the film first, then you kick the camera into reverse and shoot the bottom half of the film as you wind it back into the canister. When you kick into reverse, the lenses move in tandem from the top of the frame to the bottom. It's a really clever design and one that I haven't seen on other cameras. It's easy to imagine a similar half-frame camera built around panoramic images instead of vertically aligned ones. But that is another dream for another nap time. Let's get some film into this beast. Loading the film is a little more complicated than your average camera. As a quarter frame camera, it shoots the top half of the film as it spools out of the canister and then exposes the bottom half as it winds back in. When you load the film, you have to tell the camera how many exposures are on the roll so it can count down until you're out of film and then count back up as you wind the film back, letting you know when to stop shooting. Without this counter, you could be shooting without realizing that all of your film has been wound back into the canister, or even worse, you could open the back of the camera while film is spooled out, ruining shots. Fortunately, setting the exposure counter is as easy as can be. Pull the dial up and drop the correct number by the arrow. Then, as you shoot forward, the numbers will count down. When you reverse the film, it'll count back up. The camera recommends that you take 5 exposures at the end of the roll just to ensure that you've wound everything back into the canister. While you're certainly allowed to do it that way, you'll quickly get a sense for how the camera winds differently once the film is released from the take-up spool. But this is an advanced technique and feckless cowards need not apply. So, what's the actual shooting experience like on this camera? Film loaded, you're ready for shots. Advancing the film readies the camera for an exposure, and pressing the shutter button exposes the film. While the shutter caps at 1/100th of a second, there is a bulb mode as well as a bulb release on the front of the camera. So if you want to do long exposures and experiment with 3D light painting, this is the camera for you. Long exposure portraits are a good fit because they will give you that vintage feel. And by vintage, I don't mean that it evokes the 1990s. I mean that it evokes the 1890s. But your work isn't done when the scans come back from the lab. Taking a 3D photo is one thing, viewing it is an entirely separate concern. First, let's talk about how this camera was meant to be used, then we'll talk about more practical solutions for viewing. The ViewMaster Personal Stereo camera was designed for, surprise, surprise, use with ViewMaster Reels. When you get your negatives back, you'll notice that each image was created with either a rounded or a squared notch. This denotes which side of the ViewMaster reel the image is meant to go in. But before you can put a photo into a reel, you have to source a reel. You can buy empty reels from 3dstereo.com, but you're still only halfway there. Next, you have to cut up your negatives and insert the pictures into the viewer. The correct way to do this is with a ViewMaster slide cutter. These are incredibly rare, and it is a pay what the vendor wants if you can even find one type situation. If you're not ready to pony up for a cutter, or you simply can't find one for sale, you can cut the slides by hand and hope for the best, or you can go with a more modern solution, which is actually a more antique solution. Instead of shooting slide film and cutting the positives, we shoot negative film, have it scanned, and finish our photos digitally. The ViewMaster is essentially a toy version of the stereograph, a curio popular in Victorian parlors. In fact, the stereograph was second only to the small disc with a bird cage painted on one side and a bird on the other that you could spin around to create the illusion that the bird was in the cage. Perhaps if the stereograph also served as an effective visual metaphor for how Victorians felt repressed, it could have eked out that top slot. All that said, stereograph plates are way easier to create than ViewMaster reels. Believe me, We've tried. Once you have your scans back, you drop the images into a template, make sure you have the correct image on the correct side, and then you print them out on heavy cardstock. The stereograph viewer is so simple you can make one out of paper and a pair of reading glasses from CVS, which is exactly what we did before we upgraded to factory machine viewers. And voila, you're using 2-century-old technology to view photos captured by a device that was made over 5 decades ago. The pipeline is modern, but the end viewing experience is essentially the same as when it first appeared in the 1830s. So, biggie ups to Charles Wheatstone for getting the design right the first go-around. Flares and leaks for careless freaks. Making a whole chapter, however short, on flares and leaks might seem like a grade A hipster move, but there's a good reason for it. Because this camera is so unique in its design, you have to be extra careful about shooting directly into bright light sources like the sun. On a normal camera, signature flares and leaks can enhance a photo, giving it a dreamy, surreal tinge. Also, because frames are normally isolated inside the chamber, lens flares typically only affect the shot with the light source in it. This is not the case with the ViewMaster Personal Stereo camera. When you take a shot, that light has a very large chamber to play in. That means there will be lots of film catching that extra light as it bounces around. All told, you've got up to 8 shots that can be dinged. The stereo pair you're shooting, the 2 frames that go between them, and the 4 shots on the other half of the film strip. Keep in mind that if you lose 1 shot of a stereo pair, you lose the stereo effect, even if you get to keep the other unaffected shot. For this reason, you have to be extremely careful regarding the splash damage that a lens flare can create, and avoid those flares at all costs. If I'm being honest, these flares are just ugly. There's no art to them. It's just a lot of light smeared across a lot of film. But is it a good camera, though? All of this engineering is fascinating, but none of that matters if it can't take a good picture. This is where the wheels come off of this review, not because of the quality of the images the camera delivers, but because what does good mean? The lens is not tack sharp by any stretch. If you're used to shooting 120, the drop in resolution to quarter frame 35 will be unforgivable at best. The interocular distance is locked, which means that the further something is from the camera, the less dramatic the 3D effect will be. So landscapes are basically out. And if you want anything to be even remotely in focus close up, you're shooting f/16, which really limits your shooting options to outdoors on sunny days. On paper, it's a bad camera. Fortunately, we don't live on paper. Spec sheets don't mean diddly. The only thing that matters is how you feel when you see the images you created with the camera. There's no other metric worth exploring. When you print your first stereograph and lift the viewer up to your eyes, you are transported in a way that 2D photography can never deliver. A normal photograph freezes time and lets you look through a window into a moment. A stereo photograph freezes you and takes you back to that moment. The camera takes low fidelity and low resolution images. Even the finest film stock will reveal its grain when you're shooting quarter frame and blowing it up to full field of view imaging. Simply put, this camera would not be great if you were trying to impress James Cameron. But this device isn't in competition with high fidelity, high resolution 3D camera systems. This is for capturing 3D snapshots, and not just any snapshots, your snapshots. Sure, edges are soft, light leaks, but when you lift the stereograph viewer to your eyes, the rest of the world disappears and you're taken back to a moment. And it's not the same old silly Victorian vignette, or for those yearning for a bit of variety, the slightly lewd Victorian vignette that one typically associates with stereograph photography. It's your child, your sunrise, your family, your world that is being given life eternal through a format that is both quaint and antiquated, but somehow has lost none of its impact. That would be impressive on its own, but the design of this camera makes capture and delivery as intuitive as any point and shoot on the market today. I mean, put this interface next to a Sony camera and you tell me which one is more advanced. We've looked at plenty of cameras that combine complex engineering with simple interfaces, but this one takes the throne. The dual dial system for exposure is about as organic as an exposure system could possibly be, giving even the most novice user all the information they need through an interface that is understandable at a glance. But it's not just exposure that this camera nails. It's hard to imagine stereo capture more simplified than a single button push. If you've never shot 3D before, hell, if you've never shot film before, this would be a perfect starter camera. The interface is intuitive and it absolutely delivers on the promise of a user-friendly shooting experience. It's simple without ever sacrificing functionality, a combination rarely found in modern cameras. The quirks are among the quirkiest that I've seen, but all of that remains invisible when the camera is actually in use. You load the film and you shoot yourself silly. And when you get the shots back, you're transported to moments in ways no two-dimensional camera ever could deliver. Just ask Brian May. This camera isn't best in class. It isn't worst in class. It's the only one. And if you wanted to do what this camera does, this is the only camera that'll do it, dude, dudette, duder, and everyone in between. So do we recommend it? Yeah, duh, we bought two. If I'm being honest, I'm a little offended that you're not shooting 3D experiments already. Life is fleeting and our time on this earth is short. If you find a better way to capture moments of your life than in 3D while retaining the gentle warmth only film can deliver, show it to me and I'll start doing that instead. For now, why don't we all just turn off YouTube and go shoot some stereographs? I promise you'll be glad you did.